my therapist and I had to work through, like, I needed to stop looking at myself as a parent. I needed to like understand what does it mean for me to be a daughter and a sister? Like, what does that look like? Because I was like, I don't know.
Welcome to Sib as a Human, the podcast where we explore the messy, beautiful, and complex experience of being a sibling to someone with disabilities or significant emotional, physical, or behavioral needs, what we call being a Sib. I'm Sheena Brevig, and today I have a conversation with Sib, Sinjita Bhattacharya, and we explore the nuanced experience of what it is to be a child of immigrants, an eldest daughter of Asian and Southeast Asian descent, as well as being a Sib. Now, we talk about intersectionality in this episode, and while we define it a bit in the episode, I wanted to give you another definition and a little context. So the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's a framework for understanding how overlapping identities, such as race, gender, class, and sexuality, combine to create unique forms of discrimination and privilege. Crenshaw analyzed legal cases where courts dismissed discrimination lawsuits filed by Black women because the employer had argued that we have Black people and we have women. But when they looked further into it, it turned out that the only Black people at those companies were Black men, and the only women at those companies were white women. So you can see how those overlapping identities of being a Black person and being a woman was combining to form a unique experience of discrimination for Black women. When we are examining the Sib experience, it is really important to remember intersectionality because the Sib experience, while so common amongst so many of us, also is different in unique ways depending on our different backgrounds and our additional identities. Another topic that comes up in this episode is ableism. And while we define it in a really interesting way, I wanted to give you a simple definition that essentially says that ableism prefers people that are able-bodied, not disabled, over disabled bodies and disabled people. So it is prejudice, it is systemic oppression, and it is discrimination against people with physical, intellectual, and psychiatric disabilities. And ableism shows up in so many different ways, and this is just one conversation that touches briefly upon it. With that, Sinjita Bhattacharya is a law student, disabled person, and sibling to her autistic younger brother. Sinjita is an organizer for disability justice, abolition of carceral systems, and collective liberation. Growing up in an immigrant family, she was often an advocate for her younger brother and family's needs. Now she aims to defend marginalized people whose stories and backgrounds are silenced by the criminal punishment system. She has the ultimate hope that one day no one will be in cages. Sinjita loves to read, reconnect with her inner child, and spend time by the water. I really appreciated Sinjita's honesty and vulnerability in this conversation. If something resonates with you, let us know in the comments. Enjoy. Thank you so much, Sinjita, for joining me today for this conversation. I'm just so excited to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
You and I have had so many different conversations about what it's like to be a Sib from so many different angles, from so many different layers of our different identities that overlap as well as differ. And I wanted to start off and ask you to share a little bit about how you recognized that your Sib identity was like something you had to look at.
My Sib is younger than me. We have a 3-year age gap. So pretty much for as long as I can remember, my role in my family was being sort of like, you know, the big sister, the caretaker. But I think like I remember these salient moments that I'm sure every Sib remembers of like going to the grocery store and like my siblings having a tantrum and now everyone's staring at us and like, what do we do? And those were those moments where like it started to become very clear to me that like when we're in our house, my brother's access needs are met. No one's really expecting him to do anything other than be as he is. But when we go out and we leave that and we're confronted with the ableist society that we live in, like, wow, like this is really actually significant and influences how my family moves through the world. I started to see like the sibling relationships that my friends had or I saw on TV and like not feel that. The only way that I felt like I could have sort of like care or love or value in my family and with my brother was like being a parent. And that's how I could show my brother I loved him. That's how I could show my parents that I saw how difficult it was for them and that I could help. That's like not what children should be doing, but that's how I made sense of it. I think I realized very quickly that like being a Sib that could be useful to my family is like what was going to make me feel cared for and respected too. So I think like that at a young age, realizing like kind of where I fell in the in the social order of my family was when I started to realize how much being a sib actually did impact who I was and how I saw myself.
I relate to everything you said, and we've talked about being eldest daughters, especially in like Asian,
Yes,
Southeast Asian families, culture. Like it's a whole other level of
totally.
responsibility that is put upon us, regardless of being sibs, right? Was there a time for you where you noticed, oh, maybe this sib identity thing is like playing a bigger role in my life than I thought before?
Oh yeah. It's like it's the one moment that I can pinpoint. As a kid, we went on vacation somewhere and we were like on a flight, and I feel like, not uncharacteristically, my brother like had a tantrum and was way more of a thing than it needed to be. But it ended up with like all the flight attendants kind of threatening that we'd have to be escorted off the flight, that they'd have to do like an emergency landing, all these other passengers lecturing my parents that they didn't know how to be good parents. They shouldn't bring their kid in public if they don't know how to like manage him, all this stuff. And like, that was the first panic attack I ever had. I'm like 12. So like I'm sitting there and I'm like watching this all happen. And one, it was like recognizing this is having a really intense toll on like my mental health and like well-being. But also this is shattering everything I thought I knew about fairness and like justice and like what authority figures do and what ableism looks like. Like I didn't have those words, but I think I saw it playing out in that experience. That anxiety and like the panic attacks that I was developing were showing up in my life from that point onward frequently. Anything that happened with my brother would trigger that in a really impactful way. I found myself really afraid to go out with my family places and like really distressed because I was so afraid that something like that would happen again. When I finally did start going to therapy and trying to unpack, why do I have anxiety? What is this stemming from? And there's many answers to that, many of which will be here for
Sure.
hours if we try to unpack. But, I think I realized how much that experience and how much all the experiences that had come after that really shaped like how I was moving through the world and like how much being a sib changed how I moved through the world. I think like
Yeah.
the kind of the sensitivity to that for me was really, really heightened following some of those experiences with my family in a way that like in therapy I was like, oh, this is really, really connected. I didn't know other sibs. Like my brother had classmates in the disability classes he was in and he participated in like Special Olympics, but I never had relationships with other siblings. And I don't know if it's just like the time or like luck or what it was, but like I just didn't feel like I could really connect with anybody. And maybe it was because all of them were white, but like regardless, I felt really
Yeah.
isolated, feeling so powerless, feeling so helpless, feeling responsible to like do something, but like not really knowing what I could do.
Hmm.
I think it was only like in going to therapy and then Googling, like trying to find anything that would validate the experience of what it was like to be a sibling. And then ultimately finding some of those spaces online that I started to piece together. This wasn't some sort of like personal thing that I went through that like is unique or is, isolated to my experience, but like something that's very common and ties a lot of us together.
Yeah, I think that part of what I'm hoping we continue to explore on this podcast, both in this conversation and across future episodes, is intersectionality, right? Where it's this concept where all of these different identities we hold, if they are identities that tend to be oppressed in society, essentially those identities will like layer up and compound in unique ways.
Yeah. My parents are immigrants and also like didn't have a lot of like support at that point, especially of like how to advocate for my brother or for themselves. So like
Mm.
we're in the situation too where my parents have internalized, especially in a post 9/11 society, we need to minimize like how we behave. We need to not take up space. We need to not be difficult. I think the compounding of all those things created this really terrible equation of how all these layers were going to intersect. I think that's a really important distinction to make because yeah, I think like it's often an oversimplification to say like, well, if only my sibling wasn't disabled, like everything would be fine. It's like I don't believe that.
Yeah.
I do think that my brother being disabled has taught me a lot. Like disability is part of like what makes our society the way that it is. I think that oftentimes people lose sight of like why are people reacting this way to begin with to disabled people, just like existing?
Maybe you can define ableism for folks and then speak to your experience as, a Southeast Asian woman.
Yeah. I'll start with ableism. I always come back to Talila Lewis's definition of ableism. TL does a really good job of piecing together and interrelating all the different systems that are at play that underlie it. So the way that I would define ableism, and this is just off the top of my head, so forgive me if it's not great, but a system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds that are based on socially constructed ideas of what is normal. And that normality or normalcy is like, it's got anti-Blackness baked into it. It's got capitalism baked into it. It's got gender norms baked into it. It's got pretty much every system of oppression baked into what we think that normal should be. And ableism is what tells us that we are only worthy or only valuable if we can perform that or if we can behave in that. And I think that what's also really interesting about how Talila Lewis defines and understands ableism is that you don't have to be disabled to experience ableism. Ableism impacts all of us in the ways that we make sense of whether or not we allow ourselves to rest.
How does that show up as ableism?
We are often told and internalize this idea that we are only valuable if we just continue to keep going, right? Even when we can feel in our bodies and in our minds that we are exhausted or that we really need a break or we need to go outside and be in the sun for 20 minutes. I feel like I'm often fighting myself being no, I need to keep going. I can't take a break now. Or if I take a break now, everything will fall apart and the world will end. I think that's internalized ableism because to resist that, to say no, my body is telling me that I need this, or my mind is telling me I need to step away from this because I don't have the capacity to deal with this right now. I need to do things that restore me. Resisting that is also resisting capitalism, right? And resisting the urgency that's behind the idea that we have to do things this particular way or we have to do them with a certain speed or produce things that are regarded as perfect. All of that is baked into what ableism looks like. And I think it's the listening to ourselves and actually honoring what our bodies and minds tell us that is resisting ableism. And I think not everyone pieces that together. It took me a long time to understand that in myself too.
And yet we live in a society that upholds these values, which
Yeah.
makes it so hard, right? Which is why we have so many people anxious and burnt out and
Totally.
exhausted, not just Sibs, right? What I'm hearing is that while being a Sib is not to blame for the challenges that we are all facing in our lives and our mental health, white supremacy is. So maybe we just are done there. Just mic drop and we're done. White supremacy and ableism.
Right.
I really liked how you were summarizing the idea of ableism in this way where it's there's an idea of normal that is ideal and idealized, and it is actually impossible. But
Right.
that is that is the standard everyone is held to in our society. Anyone that differs in any way is going to be punished, whether it's not getting access to certain things or not getting resources. And I feel like when you're a Sib, we're in this really unique place to witness all the ableism, all of the terrible ways our society is not accepting of and supportive of disabled people.
I think something that I do want to name, obviously ableism isn't solved by self-care, right? We need our siblings and disabled people in general to have access to housing and support and services, right? And so I don't want to minimize that I can just do my little skincare routine and that solves it. But also I think it's hard for us to even see those things and to allow ourselves to do that. So I guess just holding that nuance feels important. It's both,
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Sibs turning the love and care in on themselves doesn't necessarily solve all the world's problems in the moment. But I have a theory that if Sibs were well rested and less stressed, we would actually probably solve a lot of the world's problems.
Yeah.
I think we can hold the nuance of self-care can feel trite, but it's not. And how do we, as Sibs, actually learn to give that to ourselves so that we can show up in our lives in the ways that we want to? We live in a time where everything is politicized and feels fraught. And also it's okay to take some time to yourself and take care of yourself,
Yeah,
because taking down systems that are oppressive is exhausting, and we can't do it in one night, and we can't do it alone.
definitely.
But what we can do, to your point, is we can actually do our skincare routine, ask someone else for help. We can say
Yeah,
no and set boundaries. Those are the little things that end up culminating towards the bigger things that allow us to do the work
absolutely.
that we're meant to do, whatever that is, whether you're creating art, whether you are out there as a lawyer for disability justice. The ways in which people and SIBs contribute to society are all important. And I think it's important that we remember nothing is black and white, even if we want it to be.
Definitely.
I'm curious how you experience that, or what you can share about what it's like for you within your culture and within your family.
I think that growing up in a South Asian family and also just like embedded in that community, there's a lot of norms of like, we don't talk about certain things and, what will people say? And we have to perform a certain type of perfectionism and a certain type of like success. And disability throws a wrench in all of that. It's in conflict with so many of those things in a way where I think my parents, to their credit, like really did have to do a lot of unlearning of those values that they were raised with. And I think it was still really challenging because even within the diaspora, like people still hold those feelings and values and beliefs really close. And so like they have community, like they have like friends who are also like South Asian immigrants who are really supportive, but supportive, like if we are invited over, like they'll make some space for my brother to hang out somewhere that's a little quieter if he needs a place to go, which is great. But like, there's not really an opportunity for I mean, this is just my read of it from afar, but it's like, there's not really like, we can't really talk about it in a way that's like
Mm,
heard or understood. And so I think like that informed a lot of that experience where it's like when we go back to visit family members in India, basically nobody knows what to say or do. But at
yeah.
least here, like there's some like willingness to understand, but still a lot of that like baked in ableism. And it's not like malice, right? Like I think it's genuinely just like people don't talk about disability in a lot of spaces, which is true regardless of
Yeah.
what culture you're a part of. I think there's been a ton of really, really, really great work in India, but it's like a very new thing. And so I think for people in my parents' generation, just wasn't really talked about. Something that was interesting that like I unpacked as part of my thesis is the word that people use to describe anyone with an intellectual disability or mental health disability in a couple of different Indian languages roughly translates to crazy. It's like the same word. And so like there's so much stigma behind that, right? And so much stigma behind like how people understand that. And like it's very much the same culture that I think is true of the United States of like putting people away where you can't see them if they make you uncomfortable. And so I have a lot of empathy for people who grew up in that environment and don't know any
Mhm.
better and like want to learn and understand how to be in community with disabled people in a way that's not that.
Right.
And I think it made it really difficult to like build community and without having to do all that work of like politically educating people.
A little over 10 years ago, I was doing a study abroad program, and I got to spend a little over a month in Eastern India, and I
Cool.
was studying mental health. I was in
Oh,
Chennai, and I
wow.
was I was studying kind of mental health in general, and I was really struck by how little people wanted to talk about it or were
Yeah.
willing to talk about it. And I'm half Japanese and grew up very much in Japanese culture, and in Japanese culture, we just don't talk about our feelings, period.
Mm,
Right? It's so new to try and talk
yeah.
about mental health. It's still really new to try and talk about how we're feeling, and especially as women.
Yeah.
Like, you said something earlier when you were just kind of describing all the ways you felt responsible in your family,
Yeah.
and you felt like, "I need to make sure that my brother isn't a burden," and, like, to society, like, when we're out in the world, and
Yeah.
that just hits so just, like, close to home for me, because in Japanese culture, it's literally like, you should not be a burden to anyone around you. Don't be too loud. Don't be too anything. Don't draw too much
Yeah.
attention. And then when you have a sibling who's like having a tantrum, or like in my case, my
Right.
brother has to use a walker and often falls down and then like knocks things over and then maybe breaks something at a store. And it's like the commotion you're causing is so
Yeah.
against the culture. It just adds that like additional layer of stress and panic when you're Sib.
Definitely. I mean, like, retweet. I agree. I think all of those things are very much what I experienced too. I think it's also very much a thing in the culture that I was raised in to like not draw attention because people will say things about that. And so you want to avoid that at any cost. So it's like, okay, we go to the temple and it's silent. And my brother has got his like drawstring bag full of like fidget toys and snacks and
Oh
literally
no.
like it's like an apocalypse bag. Like we've got everything. And like, you know, it's noisy and like he stims and he should be allowed to like exist in the world and take up space, right? That shouldn't
Yeah.
be a big deal or a deal at all. And yet, like, I remember as a kid being like so embarrassed, like mortified at the idea that
Yeah.
like people would notice or they'd say something. And so I think like it was hard for me to feel like I could relate to like that community or that space when like so much of what I knew about my culture was how we would be rejected if we didn't perform
Mm,
it, right? How can you feel part of that or accepted in that when like you're constantly afraid of being rejected? So I never really felt like I could fully feel connected to that part of myself. And then growing up in a very white community as well, like I just was constantly reminded that I was different or that I was performing
mm,
something that like wasn't my authentic self. It's a very isolating experience that gets compounded by being a sib because like you said, like I can mask a lot of my disabilities and now I know enough about like what it means to like have conversations with people who are not in the same class as me. Like I can perform
mm.
things enough to like not draw attention. I can, you know, code switch enough to like talk to white people, but my brother can't and doesn't and shouldn't have to do that. And so that's the
Right.
reality. So like it's in conflict, I think, with being able to feel accepted when I didn't really feel like those communities wanted to accept me for who I was without that performance too.
We know from the Sibs survey that so many Sibs feel like they have to constantly have everything together. They have to be perfect. They have to be the ones that their families rely on.
Mm.
And that is so much pressure.
Yeah.
In the survey, we asked folks, where did this pressure come from? Was it from your family? Was it from society, like external sources, or was it internal? Was it from yourself? And the overwhelming majority of folks said it was from themselves. How do you relate to that pressure?
Yeah. Even before you said like what the answer was going to be from the survey, I knew it was going to be intrinsic because it's like that's my life. Like I did feel like the only way that I could feel valuable to my parents
Mm,
or love from my parents, all of that felt very wrapped up in me being able to help my brother with his homework or when my
yeah.
brother was like not getting services at school, do legal research as a teenager and like help my parents write emails and send them and show up at IEP meetings. Like those were things that I could do that my parents recognized and like praised me for and other people did too. And I think that's a really like toxic thing for like a middle schooler to be experiencing because I think I internalized this message, which I don't blame my parents for this because I don't think they realized that this was happening. But I think for me, like I internalized like I'm only loved and valuable if I can
Right.
be useful, if I can be the lawyer and the advocate and the caregiver and the parent and, you know, the translator. And so I think like that is something that compounded the more I grew up and the more I put this pressure on myself to do that. I think this is very true in Asian cultures, but like academic performance was something that my parents
Yeah.
valued a lot. And so I was like, okay, if I just get enough good grades, my parents will love me. Then everything will be good, which like isn't healthy either. And at a certain point, I was like, well, this isn't working. Like, I am so anxious about being less than perfect. And that's not coming from my parents, it's coming from me. I was like burnt out and just like so unhappy.
Mm,
And it got to a point where I was like, I don't remember the last time I've done something at school or something just to do it. It's always been about performing perfectly, having to prove myself. I'm still doing the SIB thing, right? Like, and I recognize that. Like, I went to law school, I'm going to be a lawyer. Like, I'm in the helping professions. Like, I know that I have played out the stereotypical Sib arc and I have really tried to be intentional in the past few years about trying to let go of some of that, because I realized this was only harming me. My parents didn't really care about my grades to that degree, and they weren't going to love me more based on my grades. It didn't feel silly at the time, but now looking back on it, I'm like, I think I realized that holding myself to that standard like wasn't serving me and wasn't needed anymore. I think it was really scary to let go of. I think it will still take my life to work through it, but
Totally. I mean, I also related so much to performing for other people. And then it just left me realizing that I never did stuff for me and like
yeah,
only me. As I've been exploring how my Sib identity has impacted me, some of the things I've looked at is there's like an inner child that didn't feel like they got to be a full child. And
yeah,
so I'm constantly like, okay, what do I want to do now? And sometimes it's like letting myself buy myself some ice cream.
yeah,
It's been really interesting and shockingly hard to be like, what do I want in this moment? What does this like
yeah,
inner child version of me need in this moment? First, I had to recognize that I was constantly seeking like love externally in this way that was trying to fill a hole that only I could fill. My therapist literally had me get a workbook called the Self-Esteem Workbook. Terrible name, but actually is really good. And it starts off talking about the value of human life and the fact that
yeah.
every single human life is worthy just by
I feel like I've
existing.
used this workbook. It's really I have to look it up now.
I didn't even know I had low self-esteem, but it like really did help to take a step back and be like, "Oh wow, if I look at my brother and I'm like, of course he
Yeah,
deserves access, he deserves to be
yeah,
cared for, he deserves to live a full life.
yeah,
Why don't I feel like I deserve that?"
right.
It's like, why don't I feel like I'm allowed to just exist and still be worthy of love and
Yeah,
valuable to my loved ones and my community? And that was like a
yeah,
big question I really had to take apart in therapy and sit with a lot. That one
yeah,
was like deeply ingrained for me, for sure, that I was only worthy
yeah,
if I was giving to someone else and needed in some way.
yeah. My therapist and I had to work through, like, I needed to stop looking at myself as a parent. I needed to, like, understand
Mm,
what does it mean for me to be a daughter and
yes.
a sister? Like, what does that look like? Because I was like, I
Yeah.
don't know. So I'm still figuring out what that means, but I think in allowing myself to take that step back, I realized, like, I didn't know who I was, like, outside
Yeah.
of my identity as a Sib. In the past, like, 5 years or so since I've, like, not lived at home, I really felt like I have had the opportunity to figure out the answer of, like, who am I outside of this
Mm,
relationship? I feel guilty if I'm not helping, but I think that guilt and shame is, like, super ingrained in a lot of us. I think that the more that I allow myself to show up imperfectly and allow myself to show up as a human being, as a sister, as a daughter, and as a 24-year-old and not like the one who is project managing my household, I am finding that it's easier to learn who I am, but I think it's hard. I don't know if I would have gotten there without Sib community and a lot of therapy.
Part of how you and I connected was this Sibs of Color group that you started. Now it's been a couple of years. I
Yeah.
would love to hear from you. Why did you start that and what's been important about that group to you?
I mean, I think similar to your experience, I was like so relieved to find Sib community online and like so excited by that. I think it became clear to me, and I think this is true, right, even in disability spaces, but it's very white. And also, like, a lot of these spaces aren't necessarily operating with disability justice or anti ableism, like, at the forefront. And I think to engage with spaces like that as people who are marginalized, it doesn't always feel safe and doesn't always feel responsive to the things that we feel.
Can you give an example of what you saw that you were like, this isn't anti oppressive? This isn't acknowledging these other systems that are at play?
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of just like ableism in general, I think there is a very common thought process where people are very quick to talk about sort of like abandoning their Sib identity or like not wanting to have relationship with their Sibs because they're so angry
Mm,
at like how their Sib's disability has like impacted their life. I think like my cultural background and like there's a lot of like multi-generational households and like there's a lot of emphasis on like you care for your family members. And to the detriment of people's well-being, that is something that's really important. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm not necessarily saying that that's good or bad, but that's just what it is.
That's the context that you came from.
Exactly. And so I think being in some of these spaces and just like people kind of rightfully talking about like the burnout that they were experiencing as caregivers and the lack of support that they had, like I felt like there was a lot of just like people saying like, oh, well, just put your sibling in like a group home and like don't think about it anymore. Or like you don't owe anything to
Mm.
your family, like just cut them off. Like I think that it's important to have boundaries in caregiving. A lot of disabled people want the independence of like living in a place that's not their parents' home. That should be prioritized always. And also, I think it was just like I was kind of caught off guard by the lack of nuance in some of those
Mm.
conversations. For me, like in an immigrant family, like I don't really foresee like cutting my family off because like I feel like it's too much. Like I don't see that as an easy path forward or like an option that's like it is an option, but that's not going to be my first choice. And it felt like that
Mm-hmm.
was often framed or talked about as though it was without kind of the background or the context of like, well, okay, like not everybody wants that. I think another example is like people often talk about like inspiration porn, I think, in a lot of these spaces, repost a lot of stuff about like prom, right? It's like their sibling went to prom. And I'm really happy that like disabled people get to experience joy and like that's important. And we need spaces for people to do that. And also like it's infantilizing. Like it feels really
Right.
infantilizing sometimes.
Can we define inspiration porn for folks who haven't
Yes.
heard that term before? Because it's a great one.
Yes, we definitely can. And I want to give credit to Stella Young, who coined the term. But it's essentially this idea that people look at disabled people as objects of inspiration, not as like human beings that are multidimensional, have their own beliefs and wants and desires, but like rather like objectifying them as existing solely to provide inspiration to non-disabled people. And so you have like the classic examples of like a Paralympian who's like, running, it's like if he can do it, why can't you? Or like you can work hard to like, these
Right.
ridiculous like posters. It feels icky, it feels different, it feels like objectifying people because they have this identity.
Right. And it's not wrong to feel inspired by someone, but the
Yeah.
problem is that it reinforces this idea that disability is something to be overcome, right? Or it's
Yes.
tragic.
Yes.
And therefore, if they can then do something that, again, leads us toward this idealized normal, like the Paralympian who's like, look, they're running, they're doing this
Yeah.
thing that we as a society have deemed the normal thing to do. Now, therefore, they are inspirational. I think it's just such a tricky line because I think people can be inspired by seeing
Yeah.
folks overcome challenges, but the problem lies within the fact that that's therefore then the only role disability and disabled
Mhm.
people seem to take in our society, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what about the people who aren't running or overcoming,
Yeah.
quote unquote, overcoming their disability? Are they not
Right.
inspiring
Right.
for whatever else they're doing, right?
Yeah. And I think like it's like a frustrating thing to encounter in the SIP space because I'm like, well, like
Right.
I think I and you and a lot of Sibs know more than like better than others, like that disability like is not a single one-dimensional thing, right? Like so I think like seeing that in the Sib spaces have just like made me feel sort of like I don't feel like my experiences are being mirrored here. I think especially when we talk about caregiver burnout, I was getting frustrated because I'm like the reason that this is happening is because we live in an ableist society that doesn't empower people with the support they need to like be able to be part of disabled people's lives without it being this kind of like tragic burnout that often gets talked about in SIP spaces. And so that's why I was like, I'd really love to have a space that is like made up of people who in some way or another get it and get what that experience is like. So much of like my experience as a person of color has been just like trying to like explain things to white people. At a certain point, it's like I'm tired. There is a time and a place for that, but like sometimes it's not affirming to like have to do that. And so I think having a space that is for Sibs of Color, for people who have lived that, who know like in their bones like what that experience is, but with that political grounding of what anti-ableism is, of what disability justice is, I think that that is something that like I felt would be really powerful for me to have access to. And once we were able to sort of build some of those spaces and see like, wow, like there really is something here and there is a community here that's really powerful. I think it felt really important to me to like harness that and continue that.
Mhm.
I always find myself being surprised at like how much of my experiences are mirrored. And even if we don't have the same background, even if we don't share all the same identities, there is something that threads our experiences together that's like comes through in what we share that I've never found in other sub spaces. There's just so few places where we can do that and we can just show up as ourselves authentically and just be accepted for that.
I know you just said that you find yourself usually having to explain things to white people, but to not alienate the white Sibs that might be
Yes.
listening, because we do love them and we need them in this community
Yes.
so badly, what would you say to some Sibs who are like hearing this and going, oh gosh, like, have I perpetuated that?
I mean, I think the answer is probably you have. And that's okay, right? Like, I think we all have. Like, even as people of color, right? I don't personally feel that it's like useful or helpful to sit with the guilt or sit with the shame of that, but instead reflect on it, like reflect on like where is the internalized ableism, where is the internalized white supremacy that's like behind some of those things. But also like I don't think that we need to share all the same experiences to be able to be in solidarity with each other. I think the best thing that like white Sibs can do to be supportive, to show up in these spaces is like to do the political education, right? So like to learn about anti-ableism, to learn about disability justice, which emerged as a response to the largely white disability rights movement and was led and created by queer and trans disabled people of color. And I think doing that work to learn, understand, internalize, and honor like what this movement has looked like is the best way that like you can be a safe person for a lot of us to like be in community with and to feel it's safe for us to be in that community with you. And I think like sometimes like I'll see these posts and I'm like, God, like white people are back at it again. It is nice to see other white people on the post be like, no, like
Right,
that's
right,
actually not
right.
cool. And so, like, I think, being brave enough to do that is great. We're not going to get it right always, and we're not going to be perfect,
Yeah.
but that's like part of it, right? Like, being willing to learn, I think, is the best that like I can ask of people. And like, that's learning that I continue to do every day. And I'd be super happy to share some resources and books and things that like have been really instrumental for me in unpacking a lot of the dominant culture that we internalize.
For folks who just want like a couple things to start with, what might you recommend?
I think a great place to start is Alice Wong's book, Disability Visibility. I think it's a really good anthology. I feel like a lot of the voices that are represented in that book are really diverse. I really, really, really love the work of Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasinha. They've written a lot of books. Care Work is my favorite book that they've written, but they've got a lot. And I think Care Work really shaped my personal politics around thinking about disability, thinking about internalized ableism, and kind of letting go of some of that. I'd say also, I really appreciate the work that Project Let's is doing. They do a lot of really cool work thinking about psychiatric incarceration, and like it's a really interesting, like, and really good analysis. They put on like webinars. They also do a lot on social media. This is a special interest for me. So like, I'm like, I'll actually just give you like a word vomit every single resource I've ever read right now.
I love it. Yeah, no, I'm excited. I'm so excited to dig into some of this stuff myself because half of this I haven't heard of either. And so I really appreciate you sharing these resources. I just want to say that I am so grateful you started the Sibs of Color group. It was the Sibs of Color group where I felt like we all were able to maybe really honestly speak for the first time. And maybe the folks in those other spaces also were just like suppressing a lot of stuff and don't
Yeah.
feel safe enough to talk about the realities of things. So that's part of why, again, we're doing this podcast because I feel like we have to talk about it. It took me 10 years after my therapist first said, you can say sometimes it sucks to have a disabled sibling or sometimes it's really hard. And I could not. I literally was like,
Yeah.
no, I can't say that. And I
Yeah.
won't. And it's not true. But it like planted this little seed that like 10 years later, I was able to go, yeah, actually, it's okay to say sometimes it's hard.
Yeah.
Even though there's so much in me that struggles to admit that, because of all the things we've talked about already today. But it's so important to acknowledge that, because then you can start actually recognizing, like, okay, so what do I need? Is it rest? Is it to
Mhm.
take myself on a walk? Is it to get myself some ice cream? Is it to be around people who I don't need to take care of, and instead maybe actually who take care of me, right?
Right.
So anyway, I just want to say a big thank you to that group and to you. And for folks who are interested in this type of community and group, we are going to have a form in the show notes, and we will be collecting emails so that we can hopefully bring these types of groups to so many more Sibs. Please check that out along with all of these other resources in the show notes. With that, I wanted to ask you about a Sib celebration. So many Sibs do not celebrate themselves for various reasons. I know that I have really struggled to celebrate myself. So I'm trying to have a moment in our episodes where I get to have you share with us a little celebration that has to do with whatever you want it to be.
Ooh, okay. Okay, I'm celebrating that I recently got back into reading for fun. And like they are not books that matter like it's not about like solving the world's problems. They're just like fun. And it's been a while since I've done something fun, so I'm celebrating letting myself lean into that.
I'm so glad you're doing that. That's so important.
Yes. Me too.
Thank you so, so much for having this conversation with me. I feel like I have so much homework in terms of all the things I want to read more about and dig into. And I'm just so grateful that you came and spent some time with us and shared your heart and your brain with us. So thank you.
Of course. Thank you. I really appreciated the opportunity to chat. And I'm sure there's probably like a billion things that we could have talked about for hours, but this was really great to
Totally.
like dig into some of it and really, again, like just see how so many of these experiences are not ones that we hold alone. So I appreciate the
Yeah.
opportunity to be reminded of that too.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Sib as a Human. Please subscribe, like, rate, and comment to let us know what resonated with you. And the more engagement we have from listeners, the more we can bring to you all as well. Connect with us on Instagram at Sib as a Human, and subscribe to our Substack to be the first to know when new episodes, articles, and resources drop. All of these links are also in our show notes. We are currently making this show with very little funding, so if you feel so inclined, we have a donation page if you want to support Sibs and this project. If you have ideas or other ways that we can bring this podcast and community to more people, please email us at sibasahuman@gmail.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you next time, and until then, be gentle with yourself.